Hey guys, buckle up because today we're unpacking why the Japanese seem to loathe fighting American Marines more than any other unit. Think of it as the ultimate wartime rivalry with a side of sardonic tragedy. Before we dive in, smash that like button if you love a good historical smackdown, and drop a comment telling me the weirdest war movie you've ever binge-watched. Now dim the lights, curl up in a chair that creaks louder than a battlefield radio, and picture yourself standing on the blistering, shell-pocked beaches of Iwo Jima, the salty tang of seawater mixing with the acrid smell of cordite as the iconic Walt Hemingway silhouette of a Marine looms over the horizon. You can hear the distant thud of artillery like a massive drumbeat, feel the oppressive heat sear your skin, and sense the uneasy shiver of knowing that every grunt you hear could be a desperate plea for survival. The Japanese infantry, trained in the art of honor and death, saw the Marines as the embodiment of an industrialized, relentless enemy, like swapping a meticulously crafted katana for a cheap, overpowered power drill. It's a clash of cultures so stark that even today we joke about the Marines' swagger versus the samurai's stoic silence. Yet the reality was a gritty, blood-soaked nightmare where humor was the only armor left. So stick around, because we're about to peel back the mud, the myths, and the macabre motivations that made this animosity burn hotter than 1,000 incense sticks in a shrine. When the last echo of gunfire faded into the rustle of rice stalks, the village of Kuragawa settled into a hush that only night fire could break. Under a lantern that sputtered like a reluctant firefly, old Kenji gathered the wide-eyed children on the tatami-cushioned floor of his cramped home. He cleared his throat, then let the night air swallow his words as he began a confession that smelled of dried fish and gunpowder. The kids leaned in, their shadows dancing on the walls, while Kenji's voice rose and fell like a shamisen tuned to a war song. He promised them a tale of a sea that burned brighter than a samurai's honor, and a badge that haunted the Japanese heart for decades. He spoke of the beaches where white sand turned to whirlpools of smoke, each plume a black fingerprint of the Marines' landing craft. When the first American Eagle, its steel hull gleaming like a bad haircut on a movie star, loomed on the horizon, the Japanese felt a chill that rivaled the winter wind off Mt. Fuji. The Marines marched ashore with a swagger that reminded him of a comic book superhero. Only their capes were mud-splattered helmets. Young men on both sides moved like tides, crashing into each other with the inevitability of a tide pool surge, each wave carrying the smell of salt, sweat, and burnt cordite. Kenji could still hear the distant thud of mortars as a bass line to a rock concert, and the taste of iron lingered on his tongue longer than any sushi he'd ever eaten. Beside him in those black smoke nights stood Sergeant Hattori, a stone-fisted drill sergeant who taught Kenji to carve caves into coral rock, as if he were digging for treasure in a video game side quest. Hattori's bark was louder than a kettle boiling over, but his lessons saved more lives than any medical kit could. Then there was Lieutenant James, Iron Fist McAllister, an American officer whose cruelty could cut fresh tuna, yet whose fairness in granting quarter felt oddly like a grudging handshake. McAllister's visor reflected the sunrise like a disco ball, and his orders were as precise as a sushi chef's knife, leaving a trail of both dead and bewildered respect. Kenji remembered the night McAllister spared a wounded Japanese scout, a gesture that tasted like a bitter-sweet soy sauce, unexpected, salty, and impossible to forget. The dawn cracked over Coral Ridge like a cheap flick, lighting a tiny atoll that looked harmless, until the Navy's guns began to thump the hill like a bad drum solo. Kenji's men clung to the ragged bluff that overlooked a skinny beach, the sand slick with yesterday's rain and the stench of wet earth. Their foxholes smelled of mud, sweat, and the sour tang of cordite that seeped into every crevice. Above them, the sky roared with artillery fire, each shell a metallic thunderclap that rattled teeth and nerves alike. When the first wave of landing craft slid onto the surf, the Marines surged forward in perfect, methodical lines, like a choreographed dance from a war movie, only with more sand in their boots. Their rifles spat fire in unison, while fighter planes swooped low, dropping bombs that hissed like angry wasps, turning the shore into a furnace. Forward pressure was their doctrine. No pause, no retreat, just a steady grind that turned static Japanese bunkers into funeral pyres. The heat from the burning fuel soaked the air, and the crackle of flamethrowers turned hidden caves into glowing infernos, forcing even the toughest soldiers to choke on smoke. Kenji watched his comrades crumble not because the enemy outnumbered them, but because the Marines moved as a single, relentless instrument, a human bulldozer with a death wish. They snaked across the sand, using the cover of smoke and the thunder of their guns to close the distance, their boots pounding the ground like a drumbeat from a heavy metal concert. When they reached the concealed bunkers, they unleashed jets of fire that licked the walls, scorching the pine needle camouflage into ash. The smell of burning rubber and oil filled the night. Their willingness to spill blood, to take loss as a badge of honor, made surrender feel like a slow death by mosquito bite rather than an honorable exit. When the atoll finally slipped into the U.S. flag, Kenji felt the war shift from a fireworks show to a slow, grinding grind that chewed at every fiber of his unit. The Japanese supply trucks, once sleek as a samurai's katana, now sputtered like old Honda scooters, choking on a naval blockade that left them tasting salt and steel on every bite. Communications cracked as island scrub and endless tunnels swallowed radios, turning commands into ghostly whispers that disappeared into the limestone like bad Wi-Fi. Replacements arrived as rarely as a meteor in a calm sky, and each missing face deepened the feeling that the battle was becoming a saga of attrition, not heroics. Even the night air, once cool and fragrant with sea kelp, now reeked of diesel and dead fish, reminding everyone that the fight had moved from legend to logistics nightmare. The Marines, however, kept coming at the Japanese like a relentless season of Game of Thrones. Just when you thought a cliffhanger was over, another surprise attack dropped in the next episode. They slipped amphibious flanking boats onto hidden coves, splash landing with the subtlety of a cat burglar, while their 81mm mortars roared like angry dragons. Night raids turned the darkness into a jukebox of crickets, shouted commands, and the metallic twang of pistols, making the defenders' nerves twitch like a badly tuned guitar string. Every skirmish taught the Marines a new lesson, and they filed those lessons into a mental scrapbook, then used them to carve new paths through the crumbling tunnel network. For the Japanese, each fresh intrusion felt like a relentless tap dance on a fragile glass floor, one misstep and everything shattered. The terrain that had once been a natural fortress turned into a betrayer, its cliffs and coral reefs providing perfect firing platforms for the Marines' naval guns, like spotlight beams on a theater stage. Medical tents overflowed with the smell of burnt flesh and broken bones, as surgeons wrestled with wounds that looked more like modern art sculptures than human injuries. The Japanese culture, steeped in the honor of never retreating, found its code cracked like a cracked tea bowl. Every forced withdrawal felt like a personal insult to the ancestors. Supplies of antibiotics ran thin, so field medics resorted to improvising with seaweed dressings and whiskey-soaked rags, a grim cocktail that would make any kitchen nightmare blush. The result was a collective stomach churn, a sensory overload of iron, oil, and desperation that gnawed at morale faster than a pack of hyenas on a carcass. Kenji trudged back to the pine-scarred village, his boots stirring up the same dust that had once swallowed rifle smoke. Children peered from behind tatami doors, their eyes wide as lanterns, wondering if the ghost of the war would finally tuck itself away. The air tasted of sea salt and burnt incense, a strange perfume that reminded him of both prayer and petrol. He paused at the old shrine, feeling the weight of years settle like a blanket of ash on his shoulders. With a half-smile and a sigh that sounded like a war-tiresome engine, he prepared to spill the story that had been simmering since the last artillery boom. He gathered the youngsters around the bamboo fire, and like a veteran storyteller on a late-night talk show, he let the truth slip out between chuckles. "We hated the Marines because they were good at being terrible," he said, the irony hanging like a busted kite in the night sky. Yet beneath that hatred grew a twisted respect for the sheer nerve it took to charge head-on into a hail of bullets, as if they were auditioning for a Star Wars death battle. He mourned the wreckage of lives, Japanese and American alike, like a grieving chef watching his favorite dish burn beyond recognition. The children listened, their faces flickering in the firelight, feeling the grief and admiration mix like bitter coffee and sweet sake. Kenji explained that the Marines earned such dread because they were relentless, like a marching band that never missed a beat. Only the music was the staccato of gunfire. Their training forged them into machines that could sprint through rice paddies, dive into surf, and still pause to hand a wounded foe a can of beans, humanity in a hard hat. Their brutality was unapologetically visible. The smell of cordite, the splintered oak doors, the screams that climbed up the hillside like a cursed karaoke night. Yet they could also show mercy, offering water to a parched Japanese child before the next volley, a paradox that left the locals both terrified and oddly grateful. It was this duality, swift as a ninja, gentle as a tea ceremony, that made the Marines a unique specter in the villagers' nightmares. On a scrubby training ground just outside San Diego, the air tasted like burnt gasoline and seaweed, a weird cocktail that made Sergeant Elias Morgan grin like a kid in a candy store. He barked orders while the sun painted the dust gold, and his men chased rubber ducks across the sand in a drill that felt more like a slapstick comedy than war prep. Every sunrise found them packing backpacks heavier than a Thanksgiving turkey, then sprinting up a hill, only to fire at targets that moved like jittery video game sprites. The clatter of rifles, the thud of boots, and the occasional stray seagull scream formed a symphony that Morgan called the prelude to chaos. By the time the wind shifted, they were as ragged as a busted-up El Cap, but their eyes sparkled with the kind of confidence only endless repetition can forge. The drills grew hotter, the nights colder, and the marksmanship tests turned into a game of hit the target before you vomit. Morgan made them fire at tin cans, while crawling through mud that smelled like rotten onions, then pull up on an amphibious landing craft and slam doors open as if they were unveiling a surprise birthday cake for the Pacific. Their muscles memorized each motion until the fatigue became a background hum, like the low-level static before a secret transmission. One evening, after a grueling run, the men collapsed on the deck of a transport ship, the salty spray stinging their eyes as the engine's growl vibrated through their bones. The squad laughed about being as coordinated as a marching band of clumsy robots, yet their laughter hid the iron-clad discipline that would soon echo across distant reefs. Half a world away, a young Imperial officer named Captain Hiroshi Tanaka sat in a dimly lit office, the smell of incense and ink mingling with the distant rumble of naval guns. Whispered reports slipped through the chain of command like gossip about a new pop star. They spoke of Americans rehearsing night infiltrations, calling in coordinated naval gunfire, and airstrikes like an orchestra conductor with a baton made of steel. Tanaka imagined amphibious tractors rolling ashore with the grace of a malfunctioning robot from a 1950s sci-fi flick, and underwater demolition teams popping bubbles like nervous fish. A pang of unease twisted in his gut, the way a sardine feels when a net closes. He realized his enemy's practiced victory, the way children practice video game combos, smooth and relentless. The sun rose like a busted projector over the coral atoll, casting a pink haze that made the lagoon look like a giant fried egg. At 0 hour, the Marines rolled out their battle plan with the precision of a Hollywood blockbuster, except the sound effects were real and smelled like cordite and seaweed. Bunkers dotted the fringe, their concrete walls painted with the hopeful optimism of a map that promised calm beaches. The air thrummed with the low hum of radio traffic, punctuated by the occasional bark of a gull that seemed to comment on the absurdity of it all. Somewhere behind the reef, the Japanese commander tightened his grip on a battered compass, wondering if the tide had finally decided to betray him. First came a rain of shells that turned the sky into a fireworks show for the dead, shattering the illusion of any quiet landing. The pre-landing bombardment was timed like a bad joke. Just when the enemy thought the shells had stopped, a second wave roared in, catching them off guard and leaving their watchposts smelling of burnt oil and fear. Tracked amphibians, those hulking sea crawlers, sliced through the surf reefs with the grace of a drunken elephant spraying brine that stung the eyes like sea-salted bile. As the machines slammed onto the sand, the water turned black with mud, and the cries of men became a ragged chorus of what the hell. The whole scene resembled a toddler's sandbox gone wild, only the toys were loaded with 81mm mortars. From his bunker, Tanaka watched smoke curl up like a lazy dragon, while broken timber clattered like a broken piano across the dunes. The Marines moved in a terrifying, practiced rhythm. Suppressive fire thumped the ground, close assault teams ripped open pillboxes, flamethrower crews garlicked the air with searing fire, and demolition squads tossed explosives into tunnels with the nonchalance of kids flicking rocks. Each step they took was synchronized, as if the whole force had rehearsed the dance in a Broadway rehearsal hall rather than a swamp of mud and blood. The Japanese soldiers felt their world tilt. The familiar scent of wet cement was replaced by the acrid perfume of gasoline, cordite, and the sour tang of fear. The irony was not lost on Tanaka. The very maps that had promised sanctuary now led him to a nightmare that looked more like a video game level gone rogue. When the atoll finally slipped into the dust of battle, the Japanese fear turned into a stubborn, twisted adaptation that felt like a bad sequel to a superhero movie. Only the heroes were missing, and the villains were digging tunnels. Commanders ordered mile-long caves to be carved into the limestone, the sound of pickaxes echoing like a frantic karaoke night in a coal mine. Under a moon that looked like a bruised orange, they launched ferocious night counter-attacks, the flash of rifle fire mingling with the salty stink of wet gunpowder. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and diesel, and every rustle in the darkness promised another surprise ambush, as if the island itself had decided to play a never-ending game of hide and seek. The Marines, meanwhile, found themselves navigating shoals that felt like a toddler's sandbox filled with hidden Lego bricks, each step a potential explosion of pain. Tangled reefs rose like the teeth of a drowned dragon, snapping at hulls and ripping uniforms, while enemy snipers perched behind coral like paparazzi waiting for a celebrity slip. Rear area ambushes erupted from jungle thickets, the crack of a rifle startling the birds into a chaotic chorus that sounded like a punk rock concert in a swamp. The salty spray stung eyes, the heat pressed like a wet blanket, and the Marines learned fast that the ocean could be as treacherous as any enemy gunner. In response, the Marines cobbled together specialized close-quarters squads that moved with the precision of a heist crew, only their loot was survival, not vaults. They timed shore bombardments like a drummer keeping a beat, each cannon boom synchronized with infantry charges to keep the Japanese off balance. Combined arms rehearsals turned the battlefield into a grungy dance floor, where rifles, grenades, and mortars twirled in a deadly choreography that left no room for missteps. The smell of cordite mingled with the tropical perfume of frangipani, creating a bizarre perfume that said, "We mean business, and we also appreciate good foliage." When the last Japanese nest fell silent, the island exhaled a sigh that smelled like burnt coconut and diesel. The Marines' relentless training, think boot camp meets chess, had sliced through foxholes and bunkers like a chef's knife through sushi. Japanese soldiers, who had built their confidence on stone walls and doctrine, found those walls crumbling under a hail of mortars and amphibious bravado, their certainty shattered like cheap glass. Yet the victory was peppered with bodies and broken bones, a grim reminder that triumph tastes like sea-salted cordite and regret. Veterans from both sides carried the war home in scar tissue and storytelling, swapping nightmares for anecdotes over cheap whiskey. A Marine recalled the terrifying precision of a flamethrower squad, comparing it to a stunt double from a 1950s sci-fi flick, like watching a robot clean the kitchen of hell. Japanese infantrymen spoke of ingenious tunnel networks that reminded them of Nintendo's underground levels, where every step could be a surprise death trap. Over time, fear softened into a grudging respect, as each side realized the other's tenacity was as stubborn as a mule on a hot day, and sometimes the only laugh left was the irony of yelling "good job" at the enemy. Decades later, on the same white sand shore where boys once sprinted toward a blazing horizon, the veterans gathered for tea, the steam rising like ghostly incense. They passed around tin cups, letting the bitter brew mingle with the salty breeze and the distant call of gulls, nature's indifferent soundtrack. Stories floated across the fire pit, honoring the fallen and confessing the weird pride they felt for the enemy's resolve, as if swapping war medals for friendship bracelets. The meeting was a double-edged lesson. Preparation can win battles, but the echo of gunfire lingers longer than any trophy. The sun rose like a lazy orange alarm clock over the churning Pacific, spilling molten light onto the black sand of Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Samuel Hale, his uniform still smelling of shipboard soap, stepped off the Higgins boat with a fierce grin, clutching a map that looked more like a doodle than a strategy. Beside him, Sergeant Miguel Reyes, a hard-bowled veteran with a scar shaped like a lightning bolt, flashed a salute that said, "I've survived worse than this." The newest corpsman, Thomas O'Neill, tried to hide his nervous twitch by humming a ragged version of Over the Rainbow, a habit that would later earn him the nickname Birdman. Their mission was simple on paper: seize Henderson Field before the Japanese could turn it into a death trap. When the Marines pushed inland, the jungle swallowed the daylight whole, a green maw dripping with the stench of rot and mosquito-laden sweat. The air was so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through a soaked towel, and every step squelched in mud that tasted of iron and regret. Feverish nightcrawlers oozed from the underbrush, while a relentless chorus of cicadas played a soundtrack that could drive a man mad faster than any artillery barrage. Ray's seasoned nose could spot a still fresh banana leaf from 20 paces, but no amount of camouflage could hide the creeping threat of malaria, which turned even the toughest grunt into a whining toddler. O'Neill, armed with a tin of quinine and a shaky grin, handed out bitter pills like cursed candy, while Hale tried to keep morale afloat by joking that the jungle was just nature's version of a bad airbomb. Nightfall turned the island into a black and white horror movie. Patrols vanished like socks in a dryer, only to be replaced by eerie silhouettes of Japanese riflemen prowling the ridgetops. The enemy's raids were quick, silent, and as relentless as a Netflix binge. Just when you thought you could catch a breath, another wave slammed in. Marines learned to improvise, fashioning makeshift foxholes from fallen palms and using bamboo spears when ammunition ran low, turning jungle debris into a gritty toolbox. Reyes taught his men to fire their rifles in short, staccato bursts that sounded like startled fireworks, a tactic that confused the Japanese and gave the squad a morale boost comparable to finding Wi-Fi in the desert. Even O'Neill, wielding a scalpel like a tiny sword, patched up shrapnel wounds while muttering that the only thing more terrifying than a Japanese bayonet was the smell of his own socks after 3 days without laundry. The moon hung like a busted lantern over Henderson Field, its pale glow swallowed by a thunderstorm of artillery shells. At 200 hours, the Japanese launched a coordinated night assault, waves of grunts slipping through the black like bad karaoke singers. The ground erupted in a cacophony, shrapnel whistling, distant warplanes screaming, and the acrid stink of cordite that made even the bravest stomach turn. Marines huddled behind sandbags, eyes darting, hearts drumming faster than a drum solo in a rock concert. Every thump of a mortar was a reminder that survival tonight would be measured in grit, not glory. When the first wave crashed the western perimeter, Lieutenant Hale barked orders louder than a megaphone at a punk show. He leapt from the foxhole, rifle clutched like a saber, and surged forward, his squad huddling behind him like a busted Uber car. Bullets stitched the night sky, and the Marines ripped through the enemy trench with the ferocity of a cat video gone viral. Hale's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep moving, you beautiful lunatics." And the men surged, their boots slamming into mud that smelled of diesel and desperation. By the time they reached the forward line, their ammo was as low as a smartphone battery at midnight, but their morale was fully charged. Meanwhile, Sergeant Reyes scrambled to stitch together a ragged line on a jagged ridge, using overturned sandbags as makeshift benches. He shouted directions over the roar, his words as crisp as a Pop-Tart snap, coaxing terrified fresh faces into a human chain. Private O'Neill, already covered in shell-scorched grime, wriggled low through the cratered earth, his hands sticky with blood and muck, pulling wounded comrades like a reluctant Uber driver. The night air tasted of iron and fear, and each gasp from the injured was a reminder that death was just a sneaky neighbor tapping on the door. Yet, despite the chaos, the line held, the Marines' resolve hardening like overcooked spaghetti under a hot lamp. When the smoke of Guadalcanal finally cleared, the battered Marines shuffled off the island like kids leaving a particularly nasty birthday party. They were sent home to rest, to refit, and then, just as quickly as a Netflix binge, rushed back into the Pacific grind. Each new landing felt like a rehearsal for the next act, with every wave of amphibious craft testing a doctrine that was still being written in the mud. The men learned to read tide tables like horoscopes, hoping the ocean wouldn't turn their boats into a soggy mess of snorkels and lost socks. Still, the jungle's roar was replaced by the deafening crack of artillery as the campaign grew harsher with every island. Back on the grind, Hale, Reyes, and O'Neill found themselves battling more than just the Japanese. They were fighting the basics: shortage of clean water, rats the size of small dogs, and sand that seemed to crawl into every crevice of their gear. Their boots sank into reef-swept beaches that felt like walking on a giant, jagged cheesecake, each step a pitch-perfect slip and slide into death. Sapper attacks popped up like surprise party poppers, except the confetti was shrapnel, and the cheers were the terrified screams of comrades falling nearby. The smell of diesel and rot mingled with the tang of seaweed, a perfume no one would ever buy on the home front. Yet amid the chaos, they cracked jokes about being the world's worst beach vacation. "If only we'd booked a resort instead of a reef, we'd have better Wi-Fi," Reyes muttered, eyeing a pile of unexploded ordnance. Logistics became a nightmare that would make even the most seasoned supply chain nerd break out in a cold sweat. Crates of ammunition arrived late, half-filled, and sometimes with the enemy's snacks inside. The Japanese, having watched the Marines' early slip-ups, plastered their new strongholds with concrete fortifications that looked like Lego sets built by a madman, impossible to climb, impossible to ignore. Volcano ash from distant Peel like islands settled on helmets like an unsolicited face mask, turning the air into a gritty, metallic soup that burned the lungs of anyone who dared a deep breath. The men learned to sniff out hidden tunnels by the sour stench of sweat and diesel, and they laced their coffee with extra grit just to stay awake for the next surprise attack. Even the parrots on the base seemed to squawk louder, as if mocking the Marines' futile attempts to keep everything under control. The landing craft slammed into Iwo Jima's black sands like a metal beetle in a bad sci-fi flick. Volcanic ash rose in choking clouds, turning daylight into a sepia-toned funeral. Guns roared, steel cracked, and the smell of cordite mixed with salted sea spray and burnt oil. Every step forward sank into gritty pumice, the ground sighing under the weight of 100 lost dreams. Yet the Marines surged, their boots pounding a rhythm louder than a rock concert in a bunker. Private Hale, whose nerves were as jittery as a caffeine-addicted gamer, ducked a burst of shrapnel that splintered his helmet. Corporal Reyes, who swore the island smelled like a barbecue gone rogue, hauled a wounded comrade over a crater that gaped like a yawning mouth. Lieutenant O'Neill kept shouting orders with a voice that cut through the chaos like a megaphone at a punk show. The trio hacked through twisted steel and collapsed bunkers, the air thick with the sour tang of blood and diesel. When a mortar round slammed nearby, O'Neill muttered, Well, that's one way to add some fireworks to the party, and kept moving. At the crest of Mount Suribachi, a battered steel pole rose like a stubborn thumb of defiance against the sky. When the flag unfurled, its crimson field fluttered against a backdrop of smoke, turning the hill into a living Instagram post for the ages. The sight ripped a gasp from the hardened troops, a mix of awe and did we really just do that? That crackled louder than the guns below. The flag's ripple carried the weight of every fallen soldier, each thread soaked in grit, sweat, and a hint of salty sea air. It became the world's most famous selfie, emblazoned on magazines, war bonds, and everlasting memes of the Marines got this. The sun sank low over the crumbling shikumen of the village, painting the weathered wooden shutters a bruised orange that smelled of tar and sea salt. Eiko hunched over a threadbare desk, needle flashing like a tiny lighthouse, as she mended a sailor's torn uniform, her diary hidden beneath a stack of faded pattern books. Across the thin mud road, Kenji leaned against the abandoned schoolhouse, his briefcase full of ink-stained letters destined for his brother in Tokyo. The salty wind snatched at their hair, flinging gull cries that sounded suspiciously like gossip. Even the tide seemed to thrum with a nervous rhythm, as if the ocean itself were trying to eavesdrop on their thoughts. Rumors slithered through the alleys like the octopus tentacles that sometimes washed ashore, each telling a different ending. Old Mrs. Tanaka swore the approaching American Marines would bring a Broadway-style liberation, complete with jazz and vending machines that ate coins. Meanwhile, the fisherman's wife muttered that the green-eyed invaders would punish the village like a bad sequel to Saving Private Ryan, leaving nothing but scorched rice fields. Children whispered that the Marines wore helmets that glittered like superhero helmets, while the elders clucked their tongues, fearing the same helmets would hide bullets. The village square buzzed with the electric tension of a live wire, crackling with both hope and dread. In the quiet of her attic, Eiko pressed a fresh page into her diary, ink spilling like spilled soy sauce across the margins, as she confessed that the rumors made her heart flutter like a startled koi. She wrote with a wry grin that she'd rather face a raid of angry crabs than a parade of uniformed strangers humming Stars and Stripes Forever on a boombox. Kenji, meanwhile, drafted a letter to his brother, his words trembling between the polite formalities required by the army and the raw fear that his family might be turned into a footnote in an American history book. He slipped in a joke about the Marines possibly stealing his prized 1940s radio to play Elvis, hoping humor would mask the trembling in his hand. Their private scribbles became secret lanterns, flickering against the night's oppressive gloom. The moon hung low over the ragged coastline like a tired lantern, casting silver ribbons across the churning surf. The village smelled of brine and burnt kelp, while nervous whispers rose like the hiss of a kettle left too long on the stove. Children huddled under paper-thin roofs, their eyes wide as the tide dragged back, exposing a slick black sand that seemed to swallow secrets. In that uneasy hush, the elders tapped their bamboo sticks, counting the seconds until the night would swallow any stray footfall. Then out of the frothy darkness, a lone figure emerged, stumbling up the beach as if his legs were made of wet noodles. Blood smeared his uniform, turning the navy fabric into a grim watercolor of red and mud, and his eyes darted like a frightened cat caught in a thunderstorm. The Marine's breath came in ragged bursts, each gasp tasting of salt and fear, his hands clutching a broken rifle like a broken toy. Villagers stared, half in horror, half in the kind of morbid curiosity that makes you watch a sitcom tragedy rerun. Eiko stepped forward, her heart a drumbeat that threatened to drown out the crashing waves. She slipped a small glass bottle of fresh water from her sash, the liquid glinting like a promise, and fished a needle from her mother's sewing kit, its tip as sharp as a gossip's tongue. "Do I save a stranger or save my family?" she muttered, recalling her father's stubborn warning that kindness could be a costly souvenir. With a sigh that smelled of jasmine incense and rice wine, she pressed the needle into his torn sleeve, feeling the pulse of humanity thrum beneath the torn fabric. When the sea-borne rumble of the American Marine faded, the village's silence cracked like an old geta under a sudden rainstorm. Neighbors leaned over low wooden fences, whispering accusations that Eiko's family was sheltering the enemy, their words smelling of fermented miso and fear. Lantern light flickered on faces etched with suspicion, turning polite bows into darting glances. Even the village cat, usually aloof, hissed at the sudden tension, its tail a white flag of contempt. The air tasted of copper, as if the lingering gunpowder had seeped into every breath. By the next dawn, uniformed officers marched through the rice fields, boots squelching in mud like an overcooked noodle soup, demanding names and alibis. They tapped on doors with the persistence of a pop-up ad, promising security while secretly hunting collaborators. Kenji's letters, penned with trembling ink, were seized at the post office, their contents redacted with black bars that looked like comic book censor masks. The clerk, eyes darting like a nervous squirrel, handed a mutilated missive back to a trembling teenager who could only read. The villagers felt the weight of 100 unwelcome eyes, each one a silent judge. Aiko, heart thudding like a taiko drum, slipped her diary beneath a loose floorboard, stuffing it between the scent of old tatami and a lingering whiff of soy sauce. She slid the plank back with the secrecy of a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, hoping the paper would stay hidden longer than the last episode of a binge-watch series. At home, her mother slammed the kitchen door, accusing her of betraying the village's honor, while her brother whispered that compassion was a luxury no one could afford. The family's dinner table, once a place of shared laughter, now echoed with the clatter of cutlery and the sharp crack of arguments. Even the wind outside seemed to mock them, whistling a tune reminiscent of a forgotten J-pop chorus. The summer after the occupation, the village gathered under the ginkgo tree, its leaves whispering like old gossip. Some chose the safer route, sealing their mouths with the same rice straw bundles they used to patch roofs, fearing that a stray word could summon new ghosts. Others, like the stoic elderly carpenter Kenji, slipped inked scraps into hollowed-out geta wooden sandals, hiding truth beneath the smell of lacquer and pine. The air smelled of damp earth and burnt charcoal, while children chased fireflies as if they were tiny lanterns of hope. In that fragile balance, the community learned to walk a tightrope between silence and secret record-keeping. Decades later, Aiko's great-grandson, a tech-savvy teenager named Hiro, cracked open the attic's cobwebbed chest, stirring a cloud of moth-kissed dust that tasted like forgotten soy sauce. He unearthed a bundle of crumbling letters, their edges frayed like old denim, and a diary whose pages fluttered like nervous sparrows. Each page, crammed with cramped kanji and occasional English scribbles, revealed the Marine's brief cameo, sometimes a kind hand offering a bottle of water, other times a sharp accusation shouted across a smoky marketplace. The ink smelled of iron and inkwell water, while the wooden floor groaned under Hiro's weight, echoing the village's uneasy past. As he read, the past seemed less a distant war and more a sitcom episode where everyone missed their cues. The letters painted a mosaic of moments. One night the Marine, with a grin wider than a sushi roll, taught the villagers a clumsy rock-paper-scissors that ended in laughter and spilled soy. Yet another entry narrated a heated dispute over a stolen rice sack, its words as sharp as a katana, accusing the Marine of stealing more than just food. The irony dripped like rain on tatami mats. Those who whispered about him were the same ones who kept the fire of his memory alive. It felt like watching The Office in black and white. The mundane mingled with the absurd, and the audience, the descendants, never quite knew if they should cringe or clap. The contradictions stank of stale sake, but also carried the faint perfume of cherry blossoms, reminding everyone that history never smells one note. The old scribe, his keening voice cracked like the wind over basalt, begins the tale on a speck of black sand island, where the sea leaves a salty crust and gossip rolls in with the tide. Here the ground smolders underfoot, a tapestry of volcanic ash that crunches like stale popcorn whenever a boot steps on it. We meet Thomas, a fresh-out-of-boot Marine whose letters home glitter with bravado as bright as a Hollywood stunt double's grin. Across the same rumble of surf we find Kaito, a conscript whose quiet habit of sharing his meager rice with a wounded comrade defies the iron orders that braid his rifle. And waiting in a canvas-wrapped tent is Miyu, a Japanese artist summoned to paint the island for the motherland, her brushes already stained with visions of both glory and grief. The island has become a battlefield theater, its once pristine lagoon now littered with beached landing craft that resemble rusted tin cans washed ashore after a bad rave. Radio rooms sputter static like an old car engine, sending crackling reports that hop over the ocean and land in newspapers half-smoked with ink. Makeshift hospitals sprout between palm trunks, their air thick with the smell of antiseptic, sweat, and the sour bite of burnt diesel. In this crucible, the central conflict is forged. The same deed can be polished into a badge of honor or carved into a villain's scar, depending on whose pen lifts the story. Even the gulls seem to gossip, winged beats echoing the rumor that the world will soon decide which side of the story gets the souvenir photograph. Thomas, pen in hand, writes home about how he single-handedly silenced 3 enemy foxholes, each line punctuated with a grin that could shave a yak. Meanwhile, Kaito slips a bandage onto a fellow soldier's arm, his eyes flicking to the shadow of a Japanese flag that waves like a nervous dog's tail. Miyu crouches on a sand dune, her palette a riot of ochre and indigo, painting the shoreline as if it were a stage set for a kabuki play starring both hero and horror. A photographer from the Pacific Fleet snaps a picture of Thomas raising his rifle, the flash catching the spray and turning the sea into a glittering backdrop worthy of a movie poster. At the same moment Miyu sketches Kaido's gentle gesture, the ink smudging like a secret that refuses to stay hidden, while a Japanese war correspondent drafts a report that calls the same act an act of compassionate insubordination. The ridge rose like a charred backhand from a giant's hand, black ash spiraling into the bruised sky as if the island itself were exhaling fire. A lone marine hoisted a battered flag, its red weave flickering against the smoky haze, while the men around him coughed up grit and stale diesel. A crackling camera snapped, its flash a brief sun that turned the whole tableau into a postcard for history. Across the Pacific, a Japanese painter named Miyu already pictured the scene, her brush dancing between dread and reverence as if she were sketching a superhero landing. The world, unaware of the smell of cordite and burnt coconut, would later consume this single frame like a midnight snack. On that same slope, Thomas and Kaido found themselves shoulder to shoulder, not in a cinematic duel but in a clumsy, breath-punctuated standoff. Their rifles hissed, then fell silent, leaving only the rattling of their helmets and the distant groan of a collapsing bunker. "Tom," Kaido whispered, "I'm not here for a Hollywood ending," and Thomas replied, "Just trying not to choke on the smoke, buddy." The moment stretched, thin as a single hair, before the click of the shutter froze them in perpetual hesitation. It was less a clash of mythic titans, and more a nervous high-five between two exhausted players, in a war that felt like a badly scripted video game. Miyu's brushstrokes crossed oceans faster than a meme, each stroke turning mud-smeared boots into a symbol of noble sacrifice. In Tokyo, the painting hung beside a neon sign that read "Heroes," and the scent of fresh sushi wafted through the gallery, clashing absurdly with the memory of burnt rubber. Meanwhile in Washington, the photograph was printed on the backs of lunchboxes, its crisp edges echoing the crispness of a cold, corporate burger. Both nations polished the image until the raw edge, sweat, fear, the acrid taste of metal, was smoothed into a shiny badge of honor. The irony was palpable. A snapshot meant to capture chaos became a tidy postcard for propaganda, as if reality could be folded into a single Instagram filter. When the ridge fell silent, the story exploded into a riot of posters, headlines, and sermons that smelled of fresh ink and cheap coffee. American presses hammered out glossy images of Marines marching like superheroes from a 1950s comic, their faces shining brighter than a Hollywood red carpet. Across the Pacific, Japanese dispatches rewrote the same snapshots into scenes of stoic resistance, the air thick with the scent of incense and the rustle of censored telegrams. Both sides trimmed the messy edges, no mud-splattered boots, no terrified faces, so each nation could tuck the myth into its bedtime story. It was propaganda with the precision of a sushi chef, slicing away inconvenient truths. Veteran Thomas stepped onto a parade route that blared brass and smelled of hot dogs, only to watch his own words get polished into a glossy monologue on TV, like a celebrity's Instagram filter. Reporters asked him about heroism while his mind replayed the gun-caked night on the ridge, the metallic tang of blood still on his tongue. The interview cut out the part where his squad broke, replaced it with a heroic solo rescue that made him look like a one-man Avengers squad. Meanwhile, the letters he penned from the front sat in a dusty archive, their margins redacted with the neatness of a schoolteacher correcting a spelling test. Each retelling turned his lived chaos into a tidy, marketable legend. In Osaka, Kaido and Miyu felt the weight of a different kind of press, censorship that tasted like stale tea and the bitter aftertaste of fear. When Miyu submitted a poem about the smoke that choked her comrades, officials stamped it with a smiley face sticker, rewarding the sentiment that fit the narrative of honorable duty. Kaido's photographs of shattered helmets were smuggled into a hidden gallery, the metal clang of his camera shutter echoing like a covert, jazz riff in a city that demanded silence. Some images were celebrated, displayed on billboards like Neon Godzilla, while others vanished like password-protected memes. The machinery of story decided which fragments would become national trophies and which would be shredded like old ramen packets. In a dim attic that smelled of cedar and old paper, the elder scribe hunched over a trembling pile of Miyu's charcoal sketches, Thomas's letters still sealed with wax, and Kaido's whispered confessions on crumpled napkins. Behind him, Elias the photographer fanned out his dusty contact sheets like a deck of stained card playing cards, each frame humming with the distant roar of artillery. The survivors gathered like a choir of ghosts, their voices rustling like dry leaves as they sorted memory from myth. With a chuckle that trembled, the scribe said, "We're not stitching a superhero cape, we're mending a quilt that's been shredded by war," and the room lit up with the flicker of a single oil lamp. Soon the collage trove marched out of the attic and onto polished museum floors, into cramped family living rooms, and even the buzzing aisles of high school history classes where lockers still reeked of gym socks. Curators hung whole sequences, Miyu's sketch of a weary Marine beside Elias' grainy photo of the same soldier, clutching a trembling child, forcing viewers to stare at the gap between glossy propaganda posters and the gritty, mud-splattered reality. Teachers paired the images with Thomas's letters, letting students hear the ink-scented sighs behind the slogans. The irony was palpable. The same image that once rallied nations now sat next to a shaky diary entry that called the Marine just a scared kid in a borrowed uniform. Debates erupted like fireworks at a 4th of July parade. Some veterans snarled that the new displays diluted heroism, while younger crowds waved their smartphones, tweeting memes that called the Marine both saint and sitcom character. The scribe watched, smirking at the absurdity, as a professor compared the propaganda to a Marvel movie trailer, all punch, no plot. Yet in the hushed corners, grief found room to sit beside courage, sharing a table of stale cafeteria coffee and the faint scent of burnt incense from a nearby shrine. The blended narrative, messy and honest, let tears flow without drowning the bravery that still pulsed beneath the surface.